Pre-Columbian period. Yeah. It all started with an oral tradition of Mesoamerican civilization, such as the Olmecs, Mayans, and Aztecs. Mesoamerican, by the way, is a historical region and cultural area in North America. You know, when they look at some rocks. Char. Anyway guys, their oral literature usually had something to do with agriculture, mythology, astronomy, political history, and religion. While most of the literature was oral back then, the Mayans and the Aztecs created codices, folded books with type of code and pictures that recorded many facets of their societies. Then, after the Spanish sailed over in the 16th century, the colonial period began. OMG! The colonial period was important, guys, cause you know, it was the very beginning of the written tradition in Latin American literature. From the written first-person accounts of European explorers to the readings made by the priests, Latin American literature began to take in shape. Natives including Guaman Poma, who wrote documents that recorded the way life changed after the Spanish infiltrated their lands. As the colonial period wrapped up in the 18th century, Latin America had produced its first novel, countless essays and poetry. El Periquillo Sarmiento by Jose Joaquin Fernandez de Lizardi is considered the first Latin American novel. Yes, was published in 1816. Many of the novelists during this period wrote books that championed national independence from Spanish and Portuguese authorities. And that's the very beginning of the Latin American literature.
18th century! And then, during the 18th century of the historiographies had occurred, and it was penned by European explorers, philosophers, and naturalists. Important historiographical works were written by Creoles or by the Spaniards who had lived most of their lives in one or more of the viceroyalties. Jose Camilla, a Jesuit missionary along the banks of the Orinoco River, wrote the first modern account of the flora, fauna, and humans in that region, demonstrating a humanist command of classical and Renaissance rhetoric and philosophers, understanding of modern physics and geography, and it's the one and only El Orinoco Ilustrado! Hey! And it was circulated throughout the Americas and Europe in the several languages. Another Jesuit who won Jose de Iguara y Iguarin put together in a literary history of the New Spain. His incomplete Biblioteca Mexicana brings together the manuscript and published works of the authors there. And then, 6 decades later, the counter-revolutionary Mexican Mariano Beristain de Souza advanced the humanist project in his own Biblioteca Hispano-Americana Septentrional. What a history! But wait, there's more! Authors began much earlier to explore the new ways of thinking about nature and to develop new ways of imitating it in fiction and new ways of viewing their societies. The exaggeration of Baroque tendencies marks much of the literature from the first half of the century. In some authors' work, as well as Gongorism mixes with the rationalism prescribed by French neoclassicists to produce an incipient Rococo period of intense preciosity. This is especially true of the works of those authors who wrote occasional theater and poetry, and that is dramas, poems, and celebrate the arrivals or birthdays of archbishops and viceroys, military victories, and so on. This is where dramas and poems had evolved.
19th century. Romanticism. The first Latin Americans to write under the sway of Romanticism were poets such as the Cuban Jose Maria de Heredia, who had begun by mastering neoclassical poetic forms. Heredia still wrote odes in the neoclassical manner, but the emotional charge of his poetry the presentation of a self astonished by the beauty and power of nature, and his espousal of cause for the national independence were romantic to the core. Yes, Romanticism in Latin America was coeval with the movement that brought about independence from Spain to all Latin American countries, save, ironically, Heredias Cuba and the rest of the Caribbean. Heavens! There's more! Modernismo! A new literary movement had swept through the Latin America. Yes, that's right. A new literary movement. Modernismo. The first since the Barroco de Indias to have a distinctly new world inflection. Its leader was Nicaraguan Ruben Dario, the first great poet in Spanish language since Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz. Dario's slim volume of poetic prose and poetry, Azul, is a watershed for both Latin American and Spanish literature. In that spirit, Dario chose modernism as the name for his movement. This meant writing poetry of uncompromising aesthetic beauty and discarding the sentimentality and the rhetoric of Romanticism.
The 20th century. The Vanguardia. Eventually, the innovations of modernismo became routine, and poets began to look elsewhere for ways to be original. The next important artistic movement in Latin America was the avant-garde, or the Vanguardia, woohoo, as it is known in Spanish. This movement reflected several European movements, especially Surrealism. It can be safely said that the repercussions of Surrealism in Latin America lasted throughout the 20th century. The Latin American variants were distinctive and rich, and produced several masterworks not only in literature but also in the plastic arts, painting in particular. Now, next is the modern novel. The first novels to be considered modern, that is contemporary, in Latin American fiction were those written during and about the Mexican Revolution way back 1910 and 1920. While adhering to conventional forms, these novels presented an unsentimental, harsh, and action-packed world of wanton cruelty, with crisp plots in which the characters seemed to be propelled by superior forces, as in classical tragedy. The best and best known by far was Los de Abajo, or The Underdogs in 1915, by Mariano Azuela. And now to the next. The boom novels. The first of the boom novels is to acquire international recognition. It follows the antics and adventures of an Argentine bohemian exiled in Paris and his return to Buenos Aires. La Muerte de Artemio Cruz, or The Death of Artemio Cruz in 1962, by Fuentes. Revisits the theme of the Mexican Revolution, exploring its aftermath of corruption and power struggles among the revolutionaries. La Ciudad y los Perros, or The Time of the Hero in 1963, by Vargas Llosa, won the prestigious Ceibal Prize in Spain and centers on the brutal life of cadets in a military school. Lastly, the modern essay. All of this literary production was accompanied by a strong essayistic tradition whose main topic was the distinctiveness of Latin American culture, and within that culture, the individual cultures of the various countries. In many cases, the issue was how to incorporate marginal cultures, specifically African and Indian, within Latin America into the mainstream culture of the area and of each individual country. The most important and influential of these essays was Ariel in 1900s by Rodo. In the wake of Spain's humiliating defeat by the United States in the Spanish-American War, Rodo muses about the differences between the cultures of North and South America. In reply to Sarmiento's glorification of North American culture, Rodo calls for adherence to the spiritual, artistic values of Latin American culture against the pragmatism and utilitarianism of the great new power to the north. His essay had such a positive reception that aerial clubs were founded in various Latin American countries. Gracious, such a developed history.
21st century. At the turn of the 21st century, Latin American literature seemed to be shifting from the modern to the postmodern. The line of the demarcation is not clear. Postmodern literature avails itself of most of the techniques introduced by modern literature, particularly self-consciousness of its own status as literature. The difference, perhaps, is that postmodern literature does not aspire to be profound or pretend that it can make momentous pronouncements about the self, society, the nation, or humankind. The playful element of modern literature has prevailed, a move toward lightness. In Latin America, this has meant moving away from the thematics of cultural identity that dominated modern literature and going back to the Romantics. Fiction was dispersed, disseminated among characters of shifting sexuality who did not make up conventional family groups. In the plots of these novels, serendipity seems to rule. The herald of postmodern change had been Severo Sardoy, no writer of his stature or that of his predecessors, Borges, Cortázar, Garcia Marquez, etc., emerged to solidify this tendency. Don't worry, guys. It is still ongoing and stronger than relationships. Oh, just kidding. So, anyways, that is the history of Latin American literature.